This was supposed to be the Lando Norris era, according to Zach Brown. Hyping this guy up as the 2025 title favourite has done nothing but backfired tremendously. Of course, Lando is the one who's been making the mistakes and should take a majority of the blame. But the fact that this statement was even put out into the universe in the first place just makes this whole thing feel like one massive setup. And what's crazy as well is how in the media interviews building up to the weekend, the topic of Norris and Piastri having an incident came up. And just a few days later, Lando crashes into the back of his teammate. But before we talk about the crash itself, can we appreciate just how good the wheel-to-wheel racing before that was between them? Norris sends it up the inside of the hairpin, and Piastri with his 400 IQ brain sees it coming from a mile away and cuts back under on the exit. They continue to battle it out, having a drag race on the straight headed to the final chicane. It seems as though Lando is clear, but Piastri has literal balls of steel and sends it up the inside. Norris concedes but gets a great run on the next straight. He's closing in fast with DRS and is sizing up another move. And at this point, we're going to pause. In this situation, Norris has two options. A, go right and try to sweep around the outside of Piastri, which is definitely more difficult, but the safer choice, given Oscar has pretty much committed left. Or B, go left and try and force his way through an ever-closing gap, pretty much non-existent, and risk a crash. Well,
Turn one! No, he's ripped off the front wing! The McLarens collide!
Lando was really embodying the spirit of a cave diver with a loving wife and 2 kids at home, trying to squeeze through the most insanely tight gaps known to man. And for what? But in all seriousness, what did he expect was going to happen? Piastri had pretty much fully covered off the inside. It makes even less sense when you consider how well Lando drove up until that point. His pace was electric and he was on for a potential podium, but then he just decided to risk it all. And I've seen some people say, well, at least he showed some aggression. I mean, I guess, but you also need control. Controlled aggression is the key. Anyway, reality hit him very hard, since he was the one who didn't finish the race. But it very easily could have been both of them with a DNF, which would have been way more controversial than the scenario that ended up playing out. Lando did take ownership though, as he always does in situations where he's at fault, which is refreshing to see from a driver, since some of the others on the grid would rather deflect than take accountability. However, this was another flashpoint in a season where Norris has just made so many self-inflicted errors. This season, Lando has had 2 main weaknesses: qualifying and wheel-to-wheel racing. And after we do a quick review of his season so far, you'll see what I mean. Let's start with Australia. There, he was pretty much flawless. Apart from nearly sending his car to New Zealand, he didn't make a single mistake. And what I was most impressed by was how calm he was under pressure at the end, holding off a late charge from Verstappen for the win. But after that, he immediately began to struggle. In China, he made a number of mistakes in sprint qualifying and started down in 6th. He then got a bad start in the sprint race and could only finish 8th, while Oscar was 2nd. Although, his execution in the main qualifying session was a bit better and enabled him to start the Grand Prix 3rd. Eventually he would go on to finish P2 due to McLaren's amazing race pace, but it wasn't smooth sailing as his brakes were failing towards the end. Max was simply too good in Japan, but Norris still did pretty well to finish 2nd. McLaren mainly lost that win in qualifying, where Verstappen had an insane final corner that secured him pole position. Otherwise, if they were in clean air, they likely would have won. Then Bahrain was another qualifying disaster class. Imposter syndrome was going crazy that day. That was generally just a very messy weekend, because even in the race, he was out of his grid box at the start. As a result, he got a 5-second time penalty, which easily could have been avoided. And even when he was racing other drivers wheel to wheel, it just seemed like he was wasting way too much time fighting cars that weren't in his race. He ended up P3, but should have easily been P2, given the pace advantage their car had over the rest. Russell was also incredible in his defense towards the end, positioning his car perfectly to keep the McLaren behind. And it was a similar story in Jeddah as well. This time, crashing in Q3 because he got overly desperate to find lap time, even though he was looking like the faster McLaren driver all weekend. Then in the race, fighting his way back through the pack, he was getting schooled by Lewis in wheel-to-wheel battle, getting called out by the same mistake over and over again. And again, just wasting time trying to pass slower cars. In Miami, he was better in qualifying, but at the start, Verstappen ran him off the road, allowing Piastri to get by him on lap 1. And what really made the difference that day was killer instinct. Oscar was able to clear Max with intelligent car positioning and clinical execution, whereas Lando just seemed too predictable, always trying to hang it around the outside of Max when that has literally never benefited him whatsoever. More mistakes in qualifying came in Imola, but at least his race was better, finishing P2. But then, Monaco was a turning point. This was the first time we saw Lando's true form return. His lap on Saturday was brilliant, effectively guaranteeing him the win, which he claimed in style. Spain was just a case of Oscar being better, but he still secured a solid P2. And then we get to Canada. Messing up his first run in Q3 by losing it at the final chicane then got a crash course from his race engineer on Racing 101, how to brake and follow the racing line, and then on his second run, hitting the wall and ending up 7th. Then what occurred in the race was honestly one of the clumsiest moves I've seen in this regulation period. And given all the hate this guy normally gets, I knew this would just add fuel to the fire. At this point, I actually just feel sorry for him. Something is just clearly not working. He's not really ever looked super comfortable in the car. It has been said that it's very difficult to extract performance from the MCL36, much different to how last year's car needed to be driven. So far, Oscar has mastered the shift, but Lando has fallen by the wayside a bit, to the point where he's trying to do too much, getting way too desperate, and crumbling in crucial moments. The psychological aspect of sports is one I find to be very interesting, and we live in a time where social media is more prevalent than ever, and with that prevalence comes both the good and the bad. When it comes to Norris, most of what's out there falls in the latter category. The amount he gets mocked on social media has become so toxic. It's turned into an obsession of people chasing likes, and I kinda don't blame them. Some of those posts do crazy numbers. Another example is Bella Ramsey in The Last of Us, particularly with this new season having come out recently. She's been getting absolutely cooked on social media. For those of you who aren't familiar with the show, it's essentially an adaptation based on the video game. In the first season, the main character Ellie is a teenage girl who is played by Bella Ramsey. Between the first and the second game, there's a time jump. Ellie becomes a lot older, more mature, and a savage. But HBO decided to cast Bella for the role again, despite her not accurately depicting the character anymore. But that's on the casting directors, not the actors. Regardless though, Bella is the one who's been getting flamed by social media. People talking about the woke of us, stay away from us, the last of our budget, what's left of us. I ain't gonna lie, some of these are pretty funny. Trolling online has been a thing for ages now. For certain jobs, public criticism is just part of what happens, and not everyone is cut out for it. So you kinda have to know what you're signing up for. I'm not saying it's right, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that it is the way it is, and it's not changing anytime soon. Hate watching Lando has become a trend at this point. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim to be holier than thou and pretend like I haven't made fun of him a bunch of times, because I definitely have. But whenever he does have a great performance, I'm also willing to give him his flowers, just like for any other driver. For certain people though, no matter what this guy does or says, he cannot win. I guess that's a reality in life for everyone. You can't please everybody. But especially if you're a public figure, it can get rough like it has for Lando, to the point where I genuinely think that everything people say about him online affects his psyche. So much so that it seeps into his driving and triggers mistakes he might otherwise not have made if he was under less pressure. He has now deleted social media entirely to block out all the noise. But those comments about what people say never really leave the back of your mind, especially for someone like Norris, who is one of the most introspective, self-critical, and conscientious drivers on the grid. And I say self-critical, it's actually borderline self-deprecation. Typically whenever Lando has a bad performance, he'll publicly bash himself in front of everyone. It could be seen as a coping mechanism. Every human being has their own way of dealing with disappointment. Charles is another example of a driver who openly criticizes himself. And same with Lewis. Particularly early on in his career, he talked about locking himself in his hotel room for literal days on end. Now he's older and more mature, he admits that way of handling failures was counterproductive. But even now, as the most successful driver in history, he still has a tendency to question himself. Whereas someone like Max seems to just easily brush off mistakes and move forward very quickly. But underneath that self-deprecation, I actually find most of Lando's analysis to be quite objective. He's one of the most interesting personalities to break down, because he's the type of guy to wear his heart on his sleeve. When you really listen, there's definitely a mindset switch you have to make because everything is a lot more amplified. You're competing at the very sharp end of the grid against the cream of the crop in Formula 1. So you cannot afford to make mistakes because at the top, they're so rare. Especially since he's no longer a rookie or in the early stages of his career. Having driven for McLaren since his debut, the expectation is that he should be performing as close to perfectly as possible. But if psychologically as an athlete you cannot cope with the pressure of a championship, then you start to see mistakes creep in. Lando himself is his own harshest critic. So then imagine after he makes an error, he goes and ruminates on that. Then sees comments about him on social media, attacking him even more. Mentally, that's got to be extremely tough. But at the end of the day, it's just something you have to deal with. Lando has always been a driver who has been very open with his emotions, and it's why a lot of his fans love him. But he's almost the polar opposite of his teammate Oscar, who tends to be very calm and reserved. Even when something bad happens in a race, like Australia, you'll see a little bit of frustration, but not like a huge outburst. Which is where having a mentor like Mark Webber really comes in clutch, because he probably advises Oscar to keep a lid on things in front of the press, knowing how they can twist your words and use your weaknesses against you. There's something potent, in fact, about the way Piastri operates, but that doesn't mean Lando has to change. His approach is fine. I personally think he just needs a mentor of his own. Someone like Sebastian Vettel would be great, not just because he knows what it takes to win championships, but he's also a driver who's very empathetic. It would also be cool to see 2 former teammates be mentors to young drivers. To me, Lando seems like the type of guy to really care about what other people think or say about him. For example, this interview he did last year when McLaren were paying tribute to Ayrton Senna ahead of the Monaco Grand Prix.
I would probably ask him if he cared what other people thought.
You often hear Lando talk about narratives that are discussed by people on social media and journalists based on his performances on track. If he wins, they'll say it's all because of the car. And if he doesn't win, they'll say he fumbled in the fastest car. Ideally, he should be able to block all of this out and use that as fuel to prove his doubters wrong. However, for some reason, he just cannot do that. Maybe the tables will turn at some point in the year. It's still a very long season with a lot of points up for grabs. But so far, he's missed opportunity after opportunity, and it's getting hard to watch. But at the same time, it's such a fascinating dynamic between teammates. In terms of raw pace, I still put Lando ahead of Oscar. That might be controversial for some, and yes, I know that Piastri is winning the qualifying head-to-head, but the main difference between him and Lando is execution. Oscar knows how to get the job done, cleanly and efficiently, which is exactly why he's leading the championship. On the other hand, Norris is a lot more flaky and inconsistent. However, the takeaway from Canada, at least as some crumb of comfort, is that he was quicker. And oftentimes this season, he has been the faster of the 2 drivers, just very error-prone, which has been detrimental, but not defining. There is still time to turn it around. But if it's going to happen, it's going to need to happen soon. There's no guarantee that McLaren will maintain their advantage, and he needs to make the most of every opportunity availed to him. Last weekend didn't suit their car as much as others, and overall, for the Drivers' Championship, Norris didn't lose too many points to his teammate. But championships are won by maximizing every single result, making the best of both the highs and the lows. The talent and speed is there. He just needs to get rid of the self-doubt, study his teammates' precision in will-to-will combat, and stop making mistakes. I hope you all enjoyed. This one was a pretty in-depth topic, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're new to get my latest videos in the future. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.